What if the longest journey of the medieval world was not measured in miles alone, but in the slow wearing away of everything a person thought they knew? Home, comfort, certainty, even the shape of the sky above them, as tens of thousands of ordinary people walked for 3 years across mountains, rivers, and burning plains toward a single distant city they had only ever heard of in prayers. What if some of the greatest events of a whole age began not with kings and treaties, but with a restlessness in the hearts of farmers, knights, cobblers, widows, and boys, who one morning sewed a cross of cloth onto their shoulders and turned their faces east, toward a horizon most of them would never reach? Tonight, we will follow that long and quiet story. We will walk beside the men and women of the First Crusade, from the cold halls and small fields of 11th century Europe, across the great capital of the Byzantine world, through the dry hills of Anatolia and the ancient cities of Syria, to the walls of Jerusalem itself. This is not only a story of armies and battles. It is a story of hunger and dust, of faith and fear, of promises made and promises broken, of ordinary human beings caught inside a movement far larger than any of them could understand. We will move slowly, the way a long march moves, and we will try to feel what it was like to live inside one of the strangest and most consequential journeys in human memory. So let the room grow quiet around you. Lower the lights, rest your head, and let your breathing slow. There is nothing you need to do tonight but listen and drift. While the old roads of history unwind gently in the dark, the story will carry itself. You only need to let it move around you like the sound of wind against distant walls. And if you find comfort in these calm walks through the past, if you like to fall asleep somewhere long ago and far away, you are welcome to subscribe and return whenever you need another quiet night among the lost chapters of history. There is no hurry here. There never is. Now, before we set a single foot on the road to the Holy Land, we have to understand the world these travelers came from. Because to understand why so many people were willing to leave everything behind, we first have to feel how their world was shaped, its fields and fears, its churches and silences, its quiet expectations about life, death, and what lay beyond. Imagine Western Europe near the end of the 11th century. It was a land of forests and small clearings, of muddy roads that turned to rivers in the rain, of villages huddled close together where the sound of a church bell marked the passing of the day. Most people lived and died within a few miles of where they were born. The horizon of their lives was narrow, bounded by the edge of the woods, the bend of a stream, the tower of the nearest lord's stone hall. For a farmer in Normandy or Flanders or the hills of southern France, the world was small and heavy with labor. They rose before dawn, worked the soil, watched the sky for signs of frost or storm, and lay down at night in single-room houses, where smoke drifted up through a hole in the roof and animals sometimes shared the warmth. This was a world without much certainty. Harvests could fail, fever could sweep through a village in a single autumn and empty half the houses. Lords could quarrel, and their quarrels became the burdens of the poor, who watched armies trample their fields and burn their barns. Justice was rough, and mercy was uncertain. But above all this, above the mud and the labor and the fear, there stretched a vast canopy of belief. The church was everywhere. Its bells marked the hours, its calendar shaped the year. Its priests baptized the newborn, married the young, and buried the dead, and its teachings pressed constantly on the mind with one enormous, unavoidable question. What would happen to your soul when you died? For people in this age, the afterlife was not a distant abstraction. It was as real as the next winter, and far more permanent. They believed deeply in heaven and in hell, in judgment and in punishment, in the long shadow of sin that clung to every human life. A knight might spend his days in violence, taking what he wanted by the sword, and yet lie awake at night in genuine dread of what awaited him beyond the grave. A merchant might grow rich, and still feel the cold weight of guilt for the small cruelties of business. Ordinary people carried the sense that they owed a debt they could never fully repay, and that the reckoning would come. Into this constant, quiet fear, the church offered paths of relief, prayer, pilgrimage, penance, the giving of alms, the founding of monasteries where monks would pray for a benefactor's soul long after his death. And so, to understand the road to Jerusalem, we have to understand the road that already existed in the minds of these people long before any crusade was preached. That was the road of pilgrimage. For centuries, Christians had traveled to holy places to seek forgiveness and to draw closer to God. They walked to shrines where saints were buried, to churches that held sacred relics, to distant cities touched by the lives of holy men and women. And among all these places, one shone brighter than any other in the imagination of the medieval world: Jerusalem, the city where, according to Christian belief, Jesus had walked, taught, suffered, died, and risen. To Christians, it was not merely a city on a map. It was the very center of the world, the place where heaven and earth had once touched. Pilgrims had been making the long journey to Jerusalem for generations before the crusade. They traveled in small groups, poorly armed or not armed at all, trusting to God and to the charity of strangers along the way. Many never came home. Some died of disease, others of hunger, others at the hands of bandits. But those who returned were changed. They wore the palm branch of Jerusalem as a sign of what they had done, and they were honored in their villages as people who had touched something holy. The idea of the pilgrimage was woven deep into the culture, so that when the call finally came to march east in arms, it did not fall on ears unprepared. It fell on people who already believed that a great journey could cleanse a soul. Now let us step back and widen our view, because Europe was only one part of a much larger world, and the story of the crusade cannot be understood without seeing the whole map spread out in the dark. To the east lay the great Christian empire that we now call Byzantium, though its own people simply called themselves Romans, heirs to the ancient empire that had once ruled the Mediterranean. Its capital was Constantinople, a city of astonishing wealth and size, ringed by mighty walls, crowned with domes and palaces, filled with markets that sold silks and spices from lands most Europeans had never heard of. To a knight from the muddy fields of France, Constantinople would have seemed almost impossibly grand, a place out of legend, gleaming beside the water where Europe and Asia nearly touched. But Byzantium in the late 11th century was an empire under strain. For centuries it had stood as a shield between the Christian West and the powers of the East. But that shield had begun to crack. New peoples were rising and moving, and among them were the Seljuk Turks, who had swept across the lands of the Middle East and pressed hard against the Byzantine frontier. In the year 1071, at a place called Manzikert in the highlands of Anatolia, a Byzantine army had been shattered and its emperor captured. The sources describe the disaster in different ways, and historians still debate exactly how it unfolded, but its consequences are clear enough. In the years that followed, much of Anatolia, the great landmass we now call Turkey, which had been the very heartland of the Byzantine world, slipped from imperial control. Turkish lords carved out their own territories across those highlands, and the roads that pilgrims had once traveled grew more dangerous. And so, across the sea and beyond the mountains, sat a Christian emperor named Alexios Komnenos, a shrewd and careful man who had come to power in 1081 amid the chaos of a fading empire. Alexios was a survivor, skilled in the delicate arts of diplomacy, always weighing threats and searching for advantage. He looked out at his shrinking realm and understood that he needed soldiers, hardened Western fighters who could help him push back the Turkish advance and recover the lands his empire had lost. He had employed Western mercenaries before, and he thought in those terms. What he wanted was manageable, useful, controllable help. What he would eventually receive was something far larger, far wilder, and far harder to control than anything he had imagined. To understand how that came to be, we must turn to the lands beyond Byzantium, to the wider Islamic world that stretched across the Middle East, North Africa, and beyond. This was, in many ways, the most brilliant civilization of the age, while Western Europe was a land of small towns and hard labor. The great cities of the Islamic world, Baghdad, Cairo, Damascus, were centers of learning, trade, medicine, and art. Scholars there preserved and expanded the knowledge of the ancient Greeks, made discoveries in mathematics and astronomy, built libraries and hospitals and universities. Merchants moved goods across enormous distances from the shores of the Atlantic to the edges of India and beyond. To a traveler from the West, these cities would have seemed like glimpses of another, more sophisticated world. But the Islamic world of the late 11th century was also divided, and this division would matter enormously in the story to come. There was no single ruler over all these lands. The Seljuk Turks, who were Sunni Muslims, held sway across much of the region, but their power had fractured into rival lordships that often quarreled among themselves. To the south, in Egypt, ruled a rival dynasty, the Fatimids, who were Shia Muslims and who viewed the Seljuks as enemies as much as any Christian did. The city of Jerusalem itself changed hands amid these rivalries, and so the region that the Crusaders would eventually enter was not a united fortress, but a patchwork of competing powers, suspicious of one another, slow to unite against a common threat. Historians have long noted that this disunity was one of the reasons the First Crusade, against all odds, succeeded where later expeditions would fail. The Crusaders arrived at a moment when their enemies were looking at each other, not at the West. Now, hold all of this in your mind for a moment. Picture the whole vast map laid out in the flickering light. The small muddy villages of Europe, the gleaming towers of Constantinople, the great learned cities of the Islamic world, the divided lordships of the Middle East, and the sacred city of Jerusalem sitting at the center of it all, dreamed of by millions who had never seen it. Into this world, in the autumn of the year 1095, came a single sermon that would set tens of thousands of people in motion. The man who preached it was Pope Urban II. He was, by the standards of his time, a capable and thoughtful leader, a Frenchman by birth who had risen through the ranks of the Church and who understood both its spiritual power and its political weakness. The papacy of that age was locked in long struggles with kings and emperors over authority, and Urban was searching for ways to strengthen the position of the Church and to bring the quarreling warriors of Europe under some kind of common purpose. Word had reached him from the east, from Alexios in Constantinople and from others, that Christians in those distant lands were suffering, that the holy places were in danger, that pilgrims faced hardship on the roads to Jerusalem. Whether these reports were fully accurate is something historians still discuss, but they gave Urban both a cause and an opportunity. In November of 1095, at a great church council in the French town of Clermont, Urban stood before a gathered crowd of clergy and nobles and delivered the sermon that would echo across the coming centuries. We do not know his exact words. Several accounts of the speech survive, but they were written down later by different men, some of whom were not even present, and they do not fully agree with one another. This is one of the quiet frustrations of history, that a moment of such enormous consequence reaches us only in fragments, in echoes. In the reconstructions of later memory, what seems clear is the shape of what he said. He called on the warriors of the West to stop fighting one another and to turn their swords instead toward a holy purpose. He called on them to go to the aid of their Christian brothers in the East and to free the holy city of Jerusalem. And he offered something extraordinary in return: a spiritual reward, a remission of the penance owed for sin, for those who made the journey out of true devotion rather than for gain. The response, according to the chroniclers, was overwhelming. The crowd is said to have cried out in a great voice, a phrase remembered in Latin as words meaning, "God wills it," and to have surged forward to take the cross. Now, we should be careful here. Later writers loved to describe this moment as a sudden, spontaneous eruption of holy enthusiasm. And there is surely truth in the sense of powerful emotion. But great movements rarely spring from a single instant. The ground had been prepared for years, by the culture of pilgrimage, by the deep fear of sin and judgment, by the restless energy of a warrior class with few outlets, by the preaching of reform-minded clergy, and by the simple human longing for meaning and adventure and redemption, all bound together. Urban's sermon did not create these feelings. It gathered them, gave them a direction, and released them like water through a broken dam. And so across the following months, the message spread far beyond Clermont. Preachers carried it through the towns and countryside of France, into the German lands, across the Alps into Italy. Some of these preachers were sober churchmen. Others were wandering figures of intense, almost frightening charisma, who stirred up crowds with visions and prophecies. The idea took hold with a force that no one had fully anticipated. Men sewed crosses of cloth onto their clothing as a sign of their vow. From this act of taking the cross came the name by which we remember the whole movement. Though the people of the time did not use the word crusade as we do, they spoke of taking the cross, of the journey, of the pilgrimage in arms. What is striking, and what makes this story so deeply human, is who answered the call. Urban had aimed his words at the fighting men, the knights and nobles who had the training and the means to make war, and many of them did respond, as we will see. But the call also reached far down into the common people, into those who had no armor and no training, no horses and no wealth, only the same deep fear for their souls and the same hope of redemption that moved the great lords. Poor farmers, laborers, women, the old, the young, entire families. Many of them heard the call and believed that it was meant for them too. They believed that God was offering ordinary people a chance at salvation that had always seemed reserved for the powerful, and that belief would lead, in the months to come, to one of the most heartbreaking episodes of the whole story. For before the great armies of the nobles were ready to march, before the careful preparations of the lords were complete, a wave of ordinary people had already begun to move. They could not wait. Their faith burned too hot, and their patience was too thin, gathering around charismatic preachers, the most famous of whom was a figure remembered as Peter the Hermit. Tens of thousands of common folk set out toward the east in the spring and summer of 1096, months ahead of the trained armies. This great disorganized movement of the poor and the eager has come to be called the People's Crusade, and its story is a somber one. Peter the Hermit is a figure half lost in legend. The sources describe him as a small, plain man of humble appearance, but extraordinary power of speech, who rode on a donkey and stirred enormous crowds wherever he went. Later tradition would credit him with almost single-handedly launching the entire crusade, though modern historians treat these grander claims with caution. What seems certain is that he became the focus of a vast, swelling mass of ordinary people who followed him east with a mixture of holy joy and total unpreparedness. They had little food, little organization, little understanding of the enormous distances involved. Many of them, it is said, expected the journey to be short. Some of the poorest, seeing every large town along the way, are said to have asked whether this was Jerusalem at last. So little did they grasp how far away the holy city truly lay. The march of these people through Europe was a strange and troubling thing. Moving in their thousands through lands that could not easily feed them, they became a burden and a danger to the regions they passed through. Hunger drove some to theft and violence. And here the story turns very dark, and we must speak of it carefully and honestly, because it is part of the truth. As some of these disorganized bands moved through the German lands along the Rhine, they turned their violence against the Jewish communities living in the cities there. In several towns, mobs attacked and killed Jewish families in terrible acts of persecution, driven by a poisonous mixture of prejudice, greed, and a twisted idea of religious zeal. Local bishops and authorities in some places tried to protect the Jewish communities, sometimes at real risk to themselves, and in some cases they succeeded, while in others they failed or were overwhelmed. These attacks were not sanctioned by the church's leadership, and they stood against the stated purpose of the journey. But they happened, and they left a deep and lasting wound. It is one of the sorrowful truths of this history that a movement born of longing for salvation carried within it. From the very beginning, the capacity for cruelty against the innocent. We do not tell this story to dwell on horror, but because honesty requires that the shadows be named alongside the light. The great mass of the People's Crusade eventually reached Constantinople in the summer of 1096, far sooner than anyone in the city had expected. The Emperor Alexios looked upon this arriving flood of poor, ill-armed, undisciplined pilgrims with dismay. This was not the force of trained knights he had hoped for. He fed them, gave them what help he could, and then, anxious to be rid of so unruly a crowd, arranged to ferry them across the water into Asia, into the dangerous lands where the Turks held power. He warned them, the sources say, to wait for the great armies of the nobles that were still to come, and not to rush ahead into battle. But the warning went unheeded. Once across the water, in the hills of Anatolia, the people's crusade came apart. Ill-disciplined and hungry, groups of them raided the surrounding countryside, and then, drawn into the unfamiliar land, they met the Turkish forces who knew that ground far better than they did. In the autumn of 1096, the main body of these people was caught and destroyed. The details are grim, and we will not linger on them. But the essence is that the great wave of ordinary folk who had set out with such burning hope was almost entirely wiped out before the true crusade had even properly begun. Peter the Hermit himself survived, having been in Constantinople at the time, and he would go on to join the later expedition, a diminished figure carrying the memory of what had been lost. Tens of thousands of ordinary men, women, and children who had believed that God had called them personally to the Holy Road died far from home, in dry hills whose names they never knew, never having seen the city they dreamed of. It is a story that ought to sit heavily with us for a moment before we move on. These were people much like anyone in any age, full of hope, full of longing, wanting their lives to mean something, wanting to be forgiven and made clean. They walked into a vastness they could not comprehend, trusting that faith alone would carry them through, and the world proved harder and larger than their faith could survive. When we speak of the First Crusade, we often think of the knights and the great sieges to come. But before all of that, there was this quiet tragedy of the poor, and it deserves to be remembered. And so, as autumn turned toward winter in 1096, the true armies of the Crusade, the forces that Pope Urban and the Emperor Alexios had actually envisioned, were finally on the move. These were led not by wandering preachers, but by some of the most powerful nobles of Europe, men with armies, resources, and hard experience of war. They did not all travel together, and they did not all set out from the same place or by the same road. Instead, several great contingents made their separate ways across Europe, each following the lands and lords of its own leaders, all of them aiming, in the end, for the same distant meeting point at Constantinople. Among these leaders were some of the most remarkable figures of their age. There was Raymond of Toulouse, an aging and powerful lord from southern France, immensely wealthy and deeply pious, who brought perhaps the largest single force, and who saw himself as the natural leader of the whole enterprise. There was Godfrey of Bouillon, a duke from the borderlands between France and Germany, a man remembered by later tradition as the ideal Christian knight, though the real man was more complex than the legend. There was Bohemond, a formidable and ambitious warrior from the Norman lands of southern Italy, whose family had already fought against the Byzantines, and who eyed the whole venture with a shrewd calculation of what he might gain from it. There was his nephew Tancred, young and bold. There was Robert of Normandy, the son of a famous conqueror, and other counts and dukes and bishops besides, each with their own followers, their own ambitions, their own reasons for taking the cross. These were not a single army under a single command. They were a coalition, a loose gathering of proud and independent men, each accustomed to leading and unaccustomed to obeying. And this simple fact, that the crusade had no single supreme commander, would shape everything that followed. It would create rivalries and quarrels, hesitations and delays, and yet, remarkably, it would also somehow hold together across years of hardship, bound by a shared purpose, that whatever their differences, none of them ever entirely abandoned. How that fragile coalition survived the road ahead is one of the quiet wonders of this story. As these separate forces made their way east across the closing months of 1096 and into 1097, they traveled through lands both familiar and strange. Those who took the overland route through the Balkans passed through territory that was already Byzantine, and their arrival was watched with deep unease by the emperor's officials. Feeding and controlling these large armed forces as they moved through imperial lands was a delicate and difficult business. There were misunderstandings, and sometimes there was violence, as hungry soldiers clashed with local populations and imperial troops. Alexios, watching from Constantinople, grew increasingly wary of the great and unpredictable force that was converging on his capital. He had asked for help, and help was coming, but it was coming in a shape and a size that filled him with as much anxiety as hope. And so the great armies drew near to the walls of Constantinople in the cold months at the turn of the year 1097. Picture it as those weary travelers first saw it. A city unlike anything in their experience, spread along the shining water where the currents of the strait ran deep and swift, its walls stretching for mile upon mile, its towers rising in ranks, its great domes catching the winter light. Behind those walls lived perhaps 500,000 people. At a time when the largest cities of the West held only a small fraction of that number, there were palaces of marble and porphyry, churches heavy with gold and shimmering mosaic, markets where the goods of 3 continents were bought and sold, aqueducts and cisterns and public spaces built by hands long dead. To a knight from the muddy fields of Europe, Constantinople must have seemed almost like a vision of heaven itself, brought down to earth, and the chroniclers who traveled with the armies struggled to find words for what they saw. At the heart of the city, in the great palace, waited the Emperor Alexios, and now we must try to understand the delicate and difficult position in which he found himself. He had asked the West for soldiers, for manageable bands of fighting men he could use to recover his lost lands. Instead, arriving at his gates were some of the proudest and most powerful lords of Europe, each at the head of his own army, each with his own ambitions, and among them men whose families had recently made war on the empire itself. Alexios knew that these forces could be a great asset, but he also knew that they could be a terrible danger. A large Western army camped outside his walls was a threat as much as a help, and he had to find a way to turn their strength toward his purposes without letting it turn against him. His solution was to bind the leaders to him with oaths. As each of the great lords arrived, Alexios received them with lavish ceremony and generous gifts, overwhelming them with the wealth and splendor of his court, and then asked them to swear an oath of loyalty to him and to promise that any of the empire's former territories they recovered would be handed back to imperial control. This was a shrewd and reasonable demand from the emperor's point of view. The lands they hoped to march through had within living memory belonged to his empire, and he saw the crusade in part as a means of restoring what had been lost. But from the point of view of the proud Western lords, the demand was a source of friction and resentment. Some swore the oaths readily enough, others resisted, negotiated, or gave their word grudgingly, and historians still debate how sincerely each of them meant it. The relationship between the Crusaders and the Emperor, born in these tense negotiations, would remain uneasy through all the years to come, and the question of broken promises would cast a long shadow over the whole enterprise. There is a human texture to these encounters that is worth pausing on. Imagine the meeting of these two worlds. The subtle, ceremonious court of Byzantium, with its ancient traditions and its careful choreography of power, and the blunt, direct warrior culture of the Western lords, who valued personal honor and the strength of the sword above the refinements of diplomacy. Each side found the other strange, even offensive. The Byzantines regarded the Westerners as crude, greedy, and unpredictable barbarians. The Westerners regarded the Byzantines as slippery and untrustworthy. And yet, for all the friction, both sides needed each other, and so they made their arrangements, exchanged their oaths and gifts, and prepared for the next stage of the journey. Alexios provided guides, supplies, and a body of his own troops to accompany the Crusaders, and he arranged to ferry the great armies across the water into Asia, where the real trials awaited. And so, in the spring of 1097, the Crusaders crossed the strait and set foot at last in the lands where they would have to fight. Ahead of them lay the vast, dry, unfamiliar highlands of Anatolia, a land of scorching summers and bitter winters, of mountains and empty plains, held by Turkish lords who knew every ridge and watercourse of it. The Crusaders were entering hostile territory now, far from home, dependent on uncertain supplies, facing an enemy who fought in ways they had never encountered. The first great test came almost immediately at the city of Nicaea. Nicaea was an ancient and important city, once a great center of the Christian world. The place where a famous council of the early church had gathered centuries before. Now it was held by the Turks, and it served as the capital of a Turkish lord named Kilije Arslan, one of the most capable of the region's rulers. The city was strongly fortified, its walls guarded by many towers, and one side of it bordered a lake, which made it difficult to surround completely. The Crusaders arrived before its walls in May of 1097 and began a siege. For the men who had marched so far, this was their first real taste of the war they had come to fight. And it was hard, grinding, dangerous work. The Turkish Lord Kilije Arslan had at first underestimated the Crusaders, having watched the People's Crusade come apart so easily the year before. He was away campaigning elsewhere when the great armies arrived, and by the time he understood the true scale of the force before his capital, it was almost too late. He returned and attacked, hoping to break the siege, but the Crusaders fought him off in hard fighting outside the walls. The city itself held out, protected especially by its access to the lake, across which the defenders could still bring in supplies. And here the alliance with Byzantium proved its worth, for the emperor arranged to have boats carried overland and launched onto the lake, cutting off the city's last lifeline. Recognizing that the situation was hopeless, the defenders of Nicaea chose to surrender, but they surrendered to the emperor's representatives rather than to the Crusaders. This caused deep resentment among the Western soldiers. They had done the hard and bloody work of the siege, and they had expected to enter the captured city and take its wealth as their reward. Instead, imperial troops occupied Nicaea, and the ordinary Crusaders were kept outside. The sense of being cheated took root among the rank and file, and it deepened the mistrust between the Westerners and the empire. With Nicaea taken, the Crusaders resumed their march deeper into Anatolia, and now the true hardships of the land began to press upon them. It was high summer, and the heat of the Anatolian plateau was brutal for men, accustomed to the cooler, wetter climates of the West. Water was scarce, and the routes led through dry and difficult country. To ease the strain of supply, the army divided into two large groups traveling somewhat apart, and this division nearly led to disaster. In early July of 1097, near a place called Dorylaeum, one of these groups was caught by the main Turkish army under Kilije Arslan, who had gathered his forces for a great effort to destroy the invaders. The Turks fought in a manner utterly different from the heavy, close-quarter combat the Western knights knew. They were masters of mounted archery, riding swift horses, swirling around their enemies in loose formations, loosing clouds of arrows, and then wheeling away before the heavily armored knights could close with them. For the Crusaders, caught in the open and pelted with arrows from an enemy who would not stand and fight in the way they understood, it was a terrifying and bewildering experience. The first group, hard-pressed and in danger of breaking, formed a defensive position and held on desperately, protecting the non-combatants among them. The women, the clergy, the servants and pilgrims who traveled with the army, while messengers rode hard to bring up the second group. When the rest of the Crusader force arrived and fell upon the Turks from another direction, the battle turned. The Turkish army, unable to withstand the massed weight of the Western knights, once they could finally bring their strength to bear, broke and fled. The victory at Dorylaeum was hard won, and it taught the Crusaders a great deal about the enemy they faced. It also broke the power of Kilije Arslan to stop them, and after this the Turks largely abandoned the strategy of meeting the Crusaders in open battle, choosing instead to harass them, to strip the land bare before them, and to let the terrible country itself do the work of destruction. And the country did its work. The march across the interior of Anatolia in the height of that summer became a long ordeal of suffering that the chroniclers remembered with horror. The Turks had emptied the land ahead of the advancing army, destroying crops and driving off livestock, so that the Crusaders moved through a wasted country where little could be found to eat. The heat was merciless. Water sources were far apart, and men and animals died of thirst on the road. The chroniclers describe horses and pack animals collapsing and dying in great numbers, so that knights were reduced to walking, and even to loading their baggage onto oxen, sheep, dogs, and any beast that could still stand. Wealthy lords who had set out in splendor now trudged through the dust on foot. The great host that had crossed into Asia grew thinner, wearier, and more desperate with each passing week. It is worth dwelling for a moment on what this experience must have meant to the ordinary people who lived it. These were men and women who had left behind everything familiar, who had already traveled farther from home than most people of their age ever imagined possible, and who now found themselves marching through a burning, empty land, watching their animals die, feeling their own strength ebb away, uncertain whether they would ever see home again or reach the holy city they sought. And yet they kept going. What sustained them through all of this was that same deep well of faith and longing that had set them on the road in the first place. The belief that they were doing a holy thing, that God was with them, that Jerusalem lay somewhere ahead at the end of all this suffering. It is difficult from the comfort of our own time to fully grasp the strength of that conviction. But without it, the whole enterprise is impossible to understand. These people endured what they endured because they believed it had a meaning larger than themselves. As the army pushed slowly across Anatolia, it passed through regions where the population was still largely Christian, remnants of the old Byzantine world living under Turkish rule, and in some places these local Christians welcomed the Crusaders and gave them aid. One notable episode came when the crusade approached the region of Cilicia and the lands around it, where Armenian Christian communities lived. Some of the crusade leaders, particularly the more ambitious ones, began to see opportunities here, chances not merely to pass through, but to acquire lands and power for themselves. Bohemon's nephew Tancred and another leader, Baldwin, the brother of Godfrey of Bouillon, turned aside from the main march to seize control of towns in this region, and their rivalry over the spoils gave an early sign of how personal ambition would run alongside holy purpose throughout the crusade. Baldwin, in particular, went on to leave the main army entirely and to establish his own lordship far to the east, at the city of Edessa, an ancient and wealthy place with a large Christian population. Through a combination of diplomacy, marriage, and force, he made himself the ruler of Edessa in early 1098, creating the first of the Crusader states, a Western-ruled territory in the east that would outlast the crusade itself for a time. His departure took away part of the army's strength, but it also showed that some of these men were thinking not only of Jerusalem, but of the lands and titles they might carve out along the way. Meanwhile, the main body of the crusade pressed on toward its next great obstacle, and it was one that would test them more severely than anything they had yet faced. Ahead lay the city of Antioch, one of the greatest and most ancient cities of the region, a place of enormous strategic importance guarding the route into Syria and beyond. Antioch had once been among the foremost cities of the Roman and early Christian world, a place of deep sacred significance to Christians, ringed by formidable walls that climbed up the slopes of a mountain behind it and studded with hundreds of towers. It was held now by a Turkish governor, and it was so strong that taking it by direct assault seemed almost impossible. The Crusaders arrived before Antioch in October of 1097, and there they would remain locked in one of the longest and most grueling sieges of the entire medieval age for the better part of a year. When the Crusaders first arrived, they were still a large and formidable force, but the city was far too big to surround completely. Its walls were too long, its defenses too strong, and the Crusaders did not have enough men to seal it off entirely, and so they settled into a partial siege, camping before the main gates, trying to cut off what supply and movement they could, while the defenders inside remained well provisioned and secure. As the weeks turned into months, and autumn gave way to a cold and rainy winter, the situation of the besiegers grew steadily worse. The land around Antioch, which had at first provided food, was gradually stripped bare by the huge army encamped upon it. Foraging parties had to range farther and farther afield, into dangerous country where the enemy could ambush them. Supplies dwindled, and then came the hunger. The famine before Antioch, in the winter of 1097 and into 1098, was a horror that the chroniclers describe with genuine anguish. As food ran out, prices for what little remained soared beyond the reach of ordinary soldiers. Men ate their horses, then the leather of their equipment, then plants and roots and anything they could find. Many starved. Disease spread through the weakened, crowded, filthy camp, and the dead were buried in growing numbers. The winter rains turned the camp to freezing mud, and men shivered in their ragged tents, sick and hungry and far from home, staring up at the great walls of a city they could not take. In their despair, some began to lose faith. There were desertions. Even some of the leaders and prominent figures slipped away from the camp and turned back toward home, unable to endure any longer, and their departure was felt as a bitter blow to the morale of those who remained. Peter the Hermit himself, the preacher who had helped set the whole movement in motion, is said to have attempted to flee at one point, only to be brought back. The great enterprise seemed on the verge of dissolving into misery and defeat before the walls of a single city. And yet it held together, and to understand why, we have to return to that deep current of faith that ran beneath everything. In the midst of their suffering, the Crusaders interpreted their hardships in religious terms. They believed that God was testing them, punishing them for their sins, and that if they purified themselves and remained faithful, they would ultimately be rewarded. The clergy who traveled with the army preached repentance, organized processions and fasts and prayers, and worked to hold the spirit of the host together. Whatever we may think of these beliefs, they were a real force, and they gave the suffering a meaning that made it endurable. Men who might otherwise have simply given up found reasons to hold on, believing that their trial had a purpose and that deliverance would come if only they proved worthy of it. Through the long winter and into the spring of 1098, the siege dragged on. There were battles fought against Turkish forces that came to relieve the city, and the Crusaders, weakened as they were, managed to fight them off. Supplies occasionally arrived by sea through a nearby port, brought by ships from the west and from the Italian trading cities, and these deliveries helped keep the army alive at crucial moments. Slowly, the balance of the siege began to shift, though the city still held. And then, as the Crusaders' situation was becoming truly desperate, for word was reaching them that a large new Turkish army was gathering to march to Antioch's relief, which would surely crush them between the city walls and the fresh enemy force. The fortunes of the siege turned on a single act of betrayal. Among the leaders, it was Bohemond, the shrewd and ambitious Norman, who found the key to the city. Through secret negotiations, he made contact with a man inside Antioch who commanded one of the towers along the walls, a figure remembered as a disaffected officer of the garrison willing to betray his city. In exchange for reward, this man agreed to let Bohemond's men climb into his tower under cover of darkness. But Bohemond, thinking always of his own advantage, would not simply hand this prize to the crusade as a whole. He first extracted from the other leaders a promise that if he took the city through his own efforts, and if the Byzantine emperor did not come himself to claim it, then Antioch would be his to keep. It was a bold demand, and it went against the oaths they had all sworn to Alexios. But the desperate leaders, seeing no other path to victory, agreed. And so, on a night in early June of 1098, Bohemond's men crept up to the wall, climbed into the traitor's tower, and opened a gate. The Crusaders poured into Antioch, and after all those months of suffering, the great city fell to them at last. But the taking of Antioch, far from ending the Crusaders' trial, plunged them into an even more desperate situation. For only days after they captured the city, the great Turkish relief army that had been gathering arrived before its walls, the very force they had feared, and now the Crusaders found themselves in a cruel reversal. They had become the defenders, trapped inside the city they had just taken, a city they had helped to starve during the long siege, so that it held little food. Outside, a large and fresh enemy army sealed them in. The besiegers had become the besieged. Hunger returned worse than before. The Crusaders were now caught in what seemed an utterly hopeless position. Exhausted, starving, surrounded, with no realistic prospect of relief. It was in this moment of absolute despair, when the whole enterprise seemed doomed to end in the death of every man within the walls, that one of the most famous and debated episodes of the entire crusade took place. A poor pilgrim in the army, a man remembered in the sources as Peter Bartholomew, came forward and claimed that he had received visions. He said that the apostle Saint Andrew had appeared to him and revealed that a great and holy relic was buried within the city. The very lance that, according to Christian tradition, had pierced the side of Christ as he hung upon the cross. This object, known as the Holy Lance, was said to lie beneath the floor of one of the churches in Antioch, and Peter Bartholomew declared that if it were found, it would be a sign that God had not abandoned them and would grant them victory. In their desperate state, the Crusaders seized upon this hope. A group of men went to the church he had named, and there they began to dig. For a long time they found nothing, and doubt began to creep in. But then, as the story goes, Peter Bartholomew himself climbed down into the pit and drew out a piece of iron and proclaimed it to be the Holy Lance. Now, we must be careful and honest here, because this is one of the moments where history and belief become deeply entangled. Even among the Crusaders, not everyone believed. Some of the leaders and clergy were skeptical, suspecting that the lance had been hidden there beforehand, or that Peter Bartholomew was not to be trusted. Historians to this day cannot tell us with certainty what truly happened in that pit. But what matters for the story is not whether the relic was genuine. What matters is what people believed, and the effect that belief had. For the great mass of the ordinary Crusaders, the discovery of the Holy Lance was a thunderbolt of hope. It seemed to prove that God was with them after all, that their suffering had a purpose, that deliverance was at hand, and that renewed faith transformed a broken, despairing army into one willing to risk everything on a single desperate gamble. And so, at the end of June in 1098, the Crusaders made an extraordinary decision. Rather than wait to starve inside the city, they chose to march out and give battle to the great enemy army arrayed against them. Though they were outnumbered, weakened, and mounted on the last few starving horses they had left, they gathered their forces, carried the Holy Lance before them as a banner of their faith, and marched out through the gates onto the plain to face what should, by every reasonable measure, have been their destruction. What followed was a victory so unexpected that the Crusaders could only understand it as a miracle. The enemy army, for reasons that historians have long discussed, was divided by internal rivalries and mistrust among its own commanders, who did not fully cooperate or commit their full strength at the decisive moment, when the Crusaders attacked with the desperate energy of men who believed God fought beside them. The enemy coalition wavered and broke. The Great Relief Army was scattered and defeated, and Antioch was saved. To the men who lived through it, the meaning was unmistakable. God had delivered them. With Antioch secured, one might think the Crusaders would march at once for Jerusalem. But instead, a long and frustrating pause followed, and here we see once more the human weaknesses and divisions that ran through the whole enterprise. The leaders fell to quarreling over who should possess Antioch. Bohemond, who had engineered the city's capture, insisted that it was his by the agreement the others had made. But Raymond of Toulouse and some of the others objected, pointing to the oaths they had sworn to the Byzantine emperor. The dispute dragged on for months. Meanwhile, disease broke out in the crowded city, and among its victims was one of the most respected leaders of the crusade, a churchman named Adhemar, the papal representative who had traveled with the army from the beginning. Adhemar had been a steadying, unifying presence, a man who worked to hold the quarreling lords together and to keep the spiritual purpose of the crusade alive. His death was a serious loss, and without him the divisions among the leaders grew sharper. Through the late summer and autumn and into the winter of 1098, the crusade sat stalled, consumed by these disputes, while the ordinary soldiers and pilgrims grew ever more impatient and dismayed. They had come to free Jerusalem, not to watch their lords bicker over the spoils of a city in Syria. Their frustration mounted, and the sources record a growing anger among the common people of the army, who began to press their leaders to abandon their quarrels and finish the journey they had all sworn to complete. There is something deeply human and moving in this. The way the simple, direct faith of the ordinary crusaders, who had suffered most and gained least, became the force that finally shamed the great lords back onto the road. In the end, it was Raymond of Toulouse who, under this mounting pressure, set out from Antioch and led the way south toward the Holy City at last. In the early months of 1099, the other leaders and their forces followed, and the great march resumed. The final stage of the journey down the coast of the eastern Mediterranean toward Jerusalem was in some ways easier than what had come before. The Crusaders now moved through a land of many small Muslim lordships, and many of these local rulers, seeing the armed host passing through their territory, chose to make peace rather than fight. They provided the Crusaders with supplies, guides, and safe passage, preferring to speed the dangerous army on its way rather than provoke it. The Italian trading cities, whose ships followed the coast, helped keep the army supplied by sea, and so the Crusaders moved south with fewer battles, though the hardships of the road never entirely left them. As they went, the sense of anticipation grew. For men and women who had endured nearly 3 years of misery, the knowledge that Jerusalem lay just ahead must have filled them with an emotion almost too great to bear. In early June of 1099, after everything, the Crusaders finally came within sight of Jerusalem. The chroniclers describe the moment with deep emotion, how the soldiers and pilgrims, seeing at last the walls and towers of the holy city rising before them, wept and fell to their knees and gave thanks to God, overcome by the realization that they had actually arrived. Many of them had never truly expected to live to see this day. Some knelt and kissed the ground. Others prayed in silence or wept for the companions who had died along the way and would never see what they had died to reach. It is one of the most powerful images of the entire story. This ragged, weary, diminished host, a fraction of the number that had set out, standing at last before the city that had been the object of all their longing. But Jerusalem was not going to open its gates to them. The city was strongly fortified and well defended. By this point it was held not by the Turks but by the Fatimids of Egypt, the rival Muslim power from the south, who had taken control of it not long before. The Fatimid governor had prepared the city for a siege, strengthening its defenses, laying in supplies, and crucially, poisoning or blocking many of the wells and water sources in the surrounding area to deny them to the attackers. And here the Crusaders faced a terrible problem, for Jerusalem sits in a dry land, and the summer heat was fierce. Water was desperately scarce, and the Crusaders, camped before the walls in the burning June heat, suffered greatly from thirst. They had to bring water from far away, at great effort and danger. The land around the city offered little wood for building the siege engines they would need. And they knew, as they had known at Antioch, that a Fatimid relief army was likely on its way from Egypt, which meant they had to take the city quickly before that army arrived, and so began the siege of Jerusalem in the terrible heat of that summer. At first, the Crusaders lacked the means to breach the walls, and an early direct assault failed. They set to work with grim determination, gathering what wood they could, sometimes from great distances, to build the tall wooden siege towers and other engines they would need. The arrival of a small fleet of ships at a nearby port, bringing supplies, materials, and skilled craftsmen, proved crucial, for these gave the Crusaders the resources to construct their engines. Through the blazing days of June and into July, the exhausted army labored, building their towers, fighting off sorties from the defenders, and enduring the thirst and heat. In the days before the final assault, the whole host took part in a great religious procession, walking barefoot around the walls of the city in penance and prayer, watched by the defenders on the ramparts, beseeching God for victory. It was an extraordinary scene, this suffering army having come so far, humbling itself before the walls of the holy city. In mid-July of 1099, the Crusaders launched their final assault. And here we come to a part of the story that must be told with honesty, but also with restraint. for what happened when the Crusaders broke into Jerusalem was one of the darkest episodes of the entire crusade. After hard fighting, the Crusaders managed to bring one of their great siege towers against the wall and to force a way across onto the ramparts. Once they had gained a foothold, the defense collapsed, and the Crusaders poured into the city. What followed was a massacre. In the fury and exhaustion of victory, after nearly 3 years of suffering and the deaths of so many companions, the Crusaders killed great numbers of the city's inhabitants, Muslims, and according to some accounts, Jews as well, who had taken refuge in the city and who were caught up in the slaughter. The chroniclers of the time, both those who supported the crusade and those who condemned it, described the killing in terrible terms. Historians continue to debate the exact scale of the massacre, and some of the more extreme descriptions in the sources are likely exaggerated. But there is no doubt that a great and terrible slaughter took place, and that it stained the Crusaders' victory with the blood of many who had no part in the war. We do not linger on the horror of this for the sake of horror. We speak of it because it is true, and because to tell the story of the First Crusade honestly is to hold together both the extraordinary faith and endurance of these people and the terrible cruelty of which they proved capable. The same men who had wept with joy at the sight of Jerusalem, who had walked barefoot in prayer around its walls, who genuinely believed they were doing the work of God, also carried out acts of appalling violence when the city fell. This is one of the hard truths that history asks us to sit with, that human beings are capable of holding devotion and brutality within the same heart, and that terrible things are often done by people who believe themselves to be righteous. The memory of the massacre at Jerusalem would echo for centuries, shaping how later generations, both in the West and in the Islamic world, remembered the crusade, and it remains a sorrowful part of that memory to this day. When the killing finally ended and the city was in their hands, the surviving Crusaders went to the great church built over the site where Christ was believed to have been buried. And there they gave thanks. After all their suffering and all their sins, they had achieved what they set out to do. But taking Jerusalem was not the same as holding it, and the story was not yet finished. Only weeks after the city fell, the very thing the Crusaders had feared came to pass. A Fatimid army marched up from Egypt to retake the holy city. The Crusaders, though weary and reduced in number, marched out to meet it near the coastal town of Ascalon in August of 1099. Once again, against a larger force, they won a victory, catching the Egyptian army somewhat unprepared and scattering it. This battle secured the Crusaders' hold on Jerusalem for the time being and marked, in a sense, the true end of the First Crusade as a military campaign. The goal had been reached, and the immediate threat had been beaten off. Now the Crusaders had to face a different and in some ways harder question: what to do with what they had won, for the crusade had never truly planned for what came after victory. Most of the ordinary crusaders and many of the leaders considered their vow fulfilled once Jerusalem was taken, and they wished only to return home to the lands and families they had left behind so long ago. And so, in the months following the capture of the city, the great majority of the Crusaders departed, beginning the long journey back to the west. They left behind them a strange new political situation, a scattering of Western-ruled territories in the east. There was the county of Edessa, which Baldwin had established. There was the Principality of Antioch, which Bohemond had claimed and held despite his oaths to the emperor. And now there was Jerusalem itself and the lands around it, which needed a ruler. The question of who should rule Jerusalem was a delicate one, wrapped in religious meaning. When the crown was offered to Godfrey of Bouillon, the duke who had emerged as one of the most respected of the leaders, he is said to have refused to take the title of king in the city where Christ had worn a crown of thorns, accepting instead a humbler title as protector of the holy places. Whether this pious refusal happened exactly as later tradition remembered it is uncertain, but Godfrey did take up the leadership of the new realm. He did not hold it for long, however, for he died the following year. In 1100, he was succeeded by his brother Baldwin, the same ambitious man who had earlier carved out Edessa and Baldwin had no such hesitation about titles. He had himself crowned King of Jerusalem, founding a line of rulers who would govern the Crusader kingdom for generations to come. And so, out of the long march and all its suffering, there emerged these new Western states in the Eastern Mediterranean, often called the Crusader states. They were strange creations, small Latin Christian realms ruled by a Western warrior aristocracy, set down amid a population that was largely Muslim and Eastern Christian, surrounded by more powerful neighbors, dependent for their survival on a steady flow of support and settlers from the West. For a time they flourished, and a distinctive society grew up within them, in which Westerners and Easterners lived alongside one another in an uneasy but sometimes surprisingly cooperative arrangement. Western settlers married local Christians, adopted local customs of dress and food and medicine, traded with their Muslim neighbors, and made treaties and alliances that sometimes crossed the lines of faith. Travelers from the Islamic world who visited the Crusader states left accounts describing Westerners who had lived in the East for many years and had grown far more accommodating and worldly than the newly arrived Crusaders fresh from Europe. Life, as always, was more tangled and more human than the grand banners of ideology suggest. Before we follow the longer consequences of all this, let us pause and dwell for a while on what the crusade had actually cost. Of the vast number of people who had set out on the First Crusade, surely many tens of thousands, perhaps more, only a fraction ever reached Jerusalem, and only a fraction of those ever returned home. The rest lay buried along the roads of Europe and Anatolia and Syria, dead of disease, hunger, thirst, and battle, in lands whose names most of them had never known before they came to die there. Every one of those deaths was a person with a home, a family, a life left behind, a set of hopes carried on to the road. And for those who survived and returned, the experience marked them for the rest of their lives. They came home changed, having seen wonders and horrors far beyond anything in their previous world. Some came back broken by what they had endured. Some came back with a new standing, honored as men who had done a great and holy thing. All of them carried the memory of the road for the rest of their days, but the Crusader states were always fragile, and their long history was one of gradual decline. The disunity among the Muslim powers that had made the First Crusade possible did not last forever. Over the following decades, capable Muslim leaders arose who worked to unite the fractured lordships of the region and to turn their combined strength against the Western intruders. The fall of Edessa to a resurgent Muslim power in the middle of the 12th century sent a shock through the Christian West and prompted a second Great Crusade, which ended in failure. And later in that century arose the most famous of all the Muslim leaders of this age. The Sultan remembered in the West as Saladin, a Kurdish commander of remarkable ability who united Egypt and Syria under his rule, and who, in the year 1187, decisively defeated the Crusader army and retook Jerusalem itself. The loss of the Holy City, less than a century after it had been so painfully won, prompted the famous Third Crusade, which brought some of the greatest rulers of Europe to the east but failed to recover Jerusalem, though it did secure a foothold on the coast and an agreement allowing Christian pilgrims access to the holy places. And so it went, crusade after crusade across the following century, as the Western hold on the East slowly weakened. Some of these later expeditions achieved little. Others went badly astray, most infamously the Fourth Crusade, which never reached the Holy Land at all, but instead turned aside and captured and sacked the great Christian city of Constantinople itself in the year 1204. A catastrophe that gravely weakened the Byzantine Empire the Crusades had originally been meant to help, and that deepened the bitter division between the Western and Eastern branches of Christianity. There is a deep and painful irony here. The whole movement had begun, in part, with a call to aid the Christians of the East, and it ended, a little over a century later, with Western Crusaders storming and plundering the greatest Christian city in the world. The Crusader states in the East dwindled through the 13th century, their territory shrinking as the Muslim powers pressed in, until the last major Crusader stronghold on the mainland, the great port city of Acre, fell in the year 1291. With that, the era of the Crusader states in the Holy Land came to an end, roughly 2 centuries after the First Crusade had begun. Yet, the consequences of the Crusades reached far beyond the borders of the Holy Land. The crusading movement had profound effects on European society, on its economy, its religion, its politics, and its imagination. For one thing, the Crusades intensified the connections between Western Europe and the wider world. The movement of large numbers of people across such enormous distances, and the establishment of the Crusader states and the trade that flowed through them, brought Europeans into much closer contact with the more advanced and sophisticated civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond. Through this contact, and through the trade routes that the Crusades helped to stimulate, goods, ideas, and knowledge flowed into Europe in greater quantities than before. The Italian merchant cities in particular, places like Venice and Genoa and Pisa, grew immensely wealthy and powerful through the trade that the Crusades opened up, and this wealth would help lay the foundations for the great commercial and cultural flowering that Europe would experience in the centuries to come. The Crusades also had deep effects on the religious life and imagination of Europe, and they gave rise to new institutions. Among the most remarkable of these were the military religious orders, brotherhoods of warrior monks who combined the life of religious devotion with the practice of war, dedicated to defending the Crusader states and protecting pilgrims. The most famous of these were the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, organizations that grew enormously wealthy and influential, that built great castles and networks that spread across Europe and the East, and whose stories, especially the dramatic fall of the Templars in the early 14th century, would echo through history and legend for centuries. These orders were a distinctive product of the crusading age, an expression of the strange fusion of faith and war that lay at the heart of the whole movement, and the Crusades left a profound mark on the collective memory and imagination of the peoples they touched. And this may be their longest-lasting legacy of all. In the West, the Crusade became the subject of countless stories, songs, and chronicles, and the figures of the Crusade, Godfrey and Bohemond, and Raymond, and the rest, became legendary heroes. Their deeds embellished and celebrated across the centuries. The idea of the Crusade, the holy journey undertaken for the redemption of the soul, embedded itself deeply in Western culture, shaping ideals of chivalry and holy war that would persist for a very long time. In the Islamic world, the memory of the Crusades took a different but equally lasting shape, remembered as an invasion by foreign aggressors, and especially in later centuries, as a symbol of conflict between civilizations. It is one of the sobering aspects of this history that the same events are remembered so differently by different peoples, and that the memory of the Crusades has been invoked, and sometimes distorted, in the service of many different causes across the centuries, since right down into modern times. Historians themselves have long debated how to understand the Crusades, and their views have changed a great deal over time. Older generations of writers sometimes saw the Crusades in romantic terms, as a great adventure of faith and heroism, or alternatively condemned them entirely as an outburst of greed and fanaticism. More recent scholarship has tried to understand them in their own terms, to grasp what the Crusade meant to the people who took part in it, to weigh the many mixed motives that drove them. What emerges from this careful work is a picture that resists easy judgment. The Crusaders were neither simply noble pilgrims nor simply brutal invaders. They were human beings driven by a tangled mixture of genuine faith, fear for their souls, hope of reward, love of adventure, desire for land and glory, and countless other motives that lived together in the same hearts. They did things of great courage and endurance, and they did things of terrible cruelty. To understand them, we have to hold all of this together, without flinching from the darkness, and without dismissing the sincerity of their belief. Let us return, one last time, to the road itself, and to the people who walked it, for it is with them that our story should end, as it began. Close your eyes, if they are not already closed, and imagine once more that long column of travelers moving across the vastness of the medieval world. See them at dawn, breaking camp, in the cold, forming up to march another weary day toward the distant east. See the knights on their tired horses, the foot soldiers trudging through the dust, the women and servants and pilgrims moving among them, the wagons and pack animals, the banners hanging limp in the still morning air. Hear the sounds of it, the creak of leather and wood, the murmur of voices, the tramp of countless feet, the occasional peal of a distant bell or the low chanting of a prayer. This was the reality of the crusade, day after day, month after month, year after year, not the grand banners of legend, but this endless, patient, suffering forward movement of ordinary human beings toward a goal they believed in with all their hearts. They were not so different from us in the end. They wanted their lives to matter. They wanted to be forgiven for their failures. They wanted to be part of something larger than themselves. They wanted in the deepest sense to come home. Most of them never reached the holy city. They died along the way, and their graves are lost, and their names are forgotten, and yet there is a kind of quiet dignity in it. They set out for something they believed in, and they gave everything they had. To remember them is in a small way to give them back a portion of what history has taken from them. It is to say that they were here, that they mattered, that their journey was real. As our long journey through this story draws now toward its close, let the great column of travelers fade gently back into the past from which we called them. Let them dissolve into the dust of the old roads, into the silence of the forgotten graves, into the quiet of the centuries. They have marched their march, and their long day is done. The passions that drove these people, the terrors they faced, the sufferings they endured, have all been resolved now into the stillness of the past. There is something consoling in that, in the thought that even the longest and hardest journeys eventually come to an end, that even the loudest passions eventually fall silent and are gathered into the peace of the past. So let this be the note on which we close. As the fire burns low and the night deepens around us, it is time now to let the story go, to let it settle back into the deep quiet of the past where it belongs, and to let yourself drift down into rest. The travelers are at peace. The old cities sleep. Rest now. The long march is over. The road is quiet, and history, having told its story, grows silent again and waits, patient and eternal, for another night and another tale. Sleep well and let the old world fade softly around you into the deep and peaceful dark.